Welcome to Education Fast Forward. This is our 7th meeting. Today it's about quality and access to education. We have 18 centres around the world in 11 countries and many different time zones. And I'm going to hand straight over to Vera Cabral in Sao Paulo, who's going to set the scene for today's discussion. Vera?
Hello, everybody. This is a very important discussion. We are today talking about access and quality, and it's an important issue to the whole world. Actually, UNESCO has the numbers that about 57 million people, children in primary education, are not enrolled in this, should be in primary education, but are not actually enrolled at schools. And about 137 million begin primary school, and from these people, about 34 million leave school without finishing at least the primary school years. Actually, this is a big problem. And talking about the world as a whole, I will come to my country. We have a big problem, meaning related to access and quality. And this has been shown by what most of the people in the world have been watching nowadays, which are the huge protests that are occurring in our country and relate exactly to this issue. So we are I wouldn't say we are able to solve the access problem. We still have a lot of problems concerning access, but we have huge problems concerning quality. And all the protests are related to quality in public services rendering. So this is a very important and very current issue in Brazil and in most of the countries, and we have many things going on. So internet is able to mobilize people and to make people claim for their needs. Education is seen as one of the most important issues in everywhere, in every country. And so that's why we have to address our questions here in our debate in terms of how do we guarantee access and quality at the same time. We have many tools, and technology is a great enabler. And so we can, for the first time in history, address to those questions simultaneously. So PISA is a very important measure. It's a very important guideline for every country in the world. And actually, PISA is going through a lot of changes. And we would like to discuss how these changes could really act in terms of bringing access and quality at the same time, and how things are changing and how we can incorporate those changes in terms of bringing quality and guaranteeing that education really can change our realities in the countries. So I think that this is the greatest scene for the debate. And with this, I would finish my intervention.
Thank you, Vera. We'll hand over to Gavin Dykes, who's going to chair our meeting from Seattle.
Jim, and thank you, Vera, for that excellent framing of the discussion ahead. Welcome also to all those who are coming into this through live video stream. Please make sure that you tweet your comments and your questions, and we'll seek to pick these up as we go.
You've gone on mute, Gavin. I think you've touched your...
Sorry. Thank you. Welcome to everybody, and please tweet your comments, as I say, and your questions. Those questions and those comments will either be picked up in the discussion or later on when we put all the information together at the end of the event. We also have 18 telepresence units around the world in 11 countries. The countries are Australia, Brazil, Canada, France, Hong Kong, India, Portugal, South Africa, United Arab Emirates, and the UK and USA. So really covering the whole world, and will be people in those telepresence units will be contributing to the debate and also using WebEx in the background to share information. Going forward through the debate, we're privileged to welcome two excellent and influential speakers with extraordinary global responsibilities for education. Whether you're a teacher or a student or a Minister of Education, their work will touch you in some way or other. So it's what they have to say and their views of how education is developing are critical. Carroll Bellamy is chair of the Global Partnership for Education Board of Directors, and we'll hear from her shortly. But speaking first, we have Andreas Schleicher, who is Deputy Director for Education and Skills and Special Advisor on Education Policy to the OECD Secretary General. He's going to present on better skills, better jobs, and better lives. So over to you, Andreas.
Gavin, I think we have all been long enough into the economic crisis and the difficult financial issues to understand that there is no simple way for us to sort of bail ourselves out of a crisis or to stimulate our way out of a crisis or to print money our way out of a crisis. But what we can do is give more people better tools to connect, collaborate, and compete in ways that drive our economies forward. And that's why skills have really become the currency of 21st century economies. But we also know that education doesn't automatically translate into better jobs and better lives. We have, on the one hand, this toxic mix of unemployed graduates on our streets, and at the very same time, you can see that on the chart here, in some countries, a large fraction of employers who say they cannot find the people with the skills they need. So there is this mismatch between what our education systems produce and what actually our economies need to actually drive and move forward. And when you think about it, where we need to do better is we need to find out what those skills are that drive economic and social outcomes. We need to think about how we develop them in fair and equitable ways. But that's not enough. We need to find better ways to utilize the talent pool that we have, make good use out of this. And the tough question is actually who pays for what, when and how. That may be sort of easy in the area of school education, where once you start to think beyond schooling, it's actually getting into very difficult territory. We have been thinking at the OECD a lot about those kinds of questions. And what we have found is that you need to think about those issues systemically. There's no way that you can solve the issues of the future if you think about schools or universities alone. It all starts with developing the right skills. Now, of course, if you don't have the talent, there's nothing you can do about it. And there's a lot we need to do to get better at that. The first is to better understand how actually the demand for skills is evolving. If you look in the industrialized world, you can see a huge increase in the kind of occupations involving science and technology. And you look at our schools, fewer and fewer young people actually like science and technology. There are huge issues here. Then there comes the issue of improving quality and equity in education. This is a chart from our PISA outcomes where we actually measure the quality and equity of outcomes. Now, you can basically see quality upwards and equity sideways. And you can see there is a huge gulf between countries in the extent to which they equip young people with the right skills and the extent to which they equip children from all social backgrounds with the right skills. Now, you want to be in the upper right quadrants of these charts where all children do well and where success doesn't depend on social background. You don't want to be in the red one where actually performance is poor and there are large social disparities. But if you look at this closely, the number of countries actually that have made it so far in providing high quality and equitable outcomes is actually rather small. So a lot of work to improve quality and equity. But it's also about fostering culture that moves away from qualifications, education up front, handing out certificates to young people towards actually making lifelong learning a reality for all. That's the biggest challenge in front of many of our societies, particularly in the context of rapidly aging economies. It's also to do with, getting a better balance between, the provision of education and the skills used, bringing employers into the picture in the design of curricula and delivering educational programs. I just want to highlight one chart, one piece of analysis that we have recently done where we looked actually at the skills that people have, tested. That's the vertical axis of this chart. And we looked at the age. And you can see if you are in education, basically that's the red line. You're in school or university, now you learn something. Actually, the skills go up as you become older. But actually, if you combine education and work, vocational education, combining school and work, you can see you start a bit lower. That tends not to be the people's first choice. But you can actually see the growth in skills is even faster. So getting people combining education and work in creative ways is actually a very good way to actually foster skills. Even people just in work, the brown line there, you can see how they grow in their skills. The only people in trouble are the ones that are neither in education nor in work, where you can really see how the line goes south. So basically, getting employers creatively into the design and implementation of education. And then I mentioned already, sharing costs fairly. Governments benefit from education. People pay better taxes if they are more highly educated. Today, governments on average in the industrialized world make about $100,000 profit out of every graduate. There's a lot of money coming back to the taxpayers, and this profit is what they get more than what they actually pay for it. Employers get a better skilled workforce. Individuals get higher salaries. So everybody should have a reason to make more investments into skills. But figuring that out, not an easy thing to do. And of course, it's also to do with how do we deal with this globally. The issues of brain gain, brain drain, I think very, very important issues we need to figure out creatively. But that's only one part of the coin, the development of skills. The next question is, how do you actually make sure that people get a chance to use their talent? There are a lot of countries, if you go to Egypt these days, there are a lot of educated people, but they don't get a chance to use their skills. So there are a lot of issues about sort of creating an environment that deploys the skill. But the toughest challenge, and with that I want to conclude actually, is how do we put skills to effective use? There's no reason for us to develop great skills if they're not matched to the kind of jobs. And particularly in Europe, we are very, very, very good at hanging on to jobs that are actually not making great use of people's skills. Nobody wants to close a car factory for well understandable reasons, but that's actually the kind of sectors where the talent of our economies is often not very well used. I want to show you this in one chart here. This basically tells you about the share of young people or share of adults who tell you that they have better skills than what they need at their current work. And you can see that's about 1/3 of people, where we can actually see we're not using their skills well. There are also some people who need more training, but this issue is not hypothetical, it's real. And it does have consequences. If you have a great job and you have great skills, that's the green line. We call it high skills match situation. You earn a lot when you're young and you keep growing in your earnings. You are better and better off as you become older. If you don't have the right skills, but you have a job that needs great skills, that's what we call a skill deficit. That's the yellow line. You earn a lot lower at the beginning of your life. Now, and that's clear because your employer is not going to pay you for things that you don't know. But actually, you keep growing, you keep developing because the skills that are required are the ones that actually drive you forward. But if you have skills that are not used in your work, you are in the orange or red lines, and that basically means your life chances are deteriorating. And what we're actually seeing is that the impact which skills have on people's life chances is decreasing over the life cycle of people and is increasing over the life cycle of people, and it is increasing over time. Never before have the highly skilled people had the life chances that they have today. And never before have people at the low end of the skill spectrum paid as much of an economic and social price for them. Very, very important issue. So what can we do about it? The first is just telling people the truth, being much better about providing information about the kind of skills that are needed and that are available. It sounds so simple, but ask yourself, where do you actually find out? What are the skills in demand? What are the skills that are actually available? It's very, very hard. Helping young people to gain a foothold in the labor market and bringing social partners together to make that happen. Some countries are doing really well, others are doing poorly, and you find them in the same continent like Europe, next to each other. So there's a lot we can actually do about it. Making skills more transparent. You can have great skills, but if your employer doesn't know about it, it's not going to help you. Making those skills more transparent, very, very important. Facilitating mobility, helping people move to where the jobs are, and helping jobs move to where the skills are. You can do a lot better on that. Helping employers to make better use of their employee skills. Crucially important. How do we actually develop an environment where employers sort of really reap the talent? It's about, creating more flexible, more innovative work environments. A lot of things that we can do to actually do better on this. Creating more high value-added jobs. Moving our economies up the value chain. If you're in Singapore today, if you're an employer in Singapore, you're going to be taxed more if you hire low-skilled people because the economy wants to move forward. Hong Kong, over the last 15 years, has moved 90% of its manufacturing industry out of China. And they didn't worry about jobs that were lost. They wanted to get rid of those jobs to create the space for actually more high value added jobs. These are the kind of things entrepreneurship. I could add lots of facets to this picture, but it's really about becoming better at matching skill demand and supply. I want to conclude, that's sort of the overall picture of it, but I want to conclude with sort of 4 tough questions where we really have to struggle. The first is, how do we prioritize investment? Now, some people say you need to invest in early childhood education. Others say you need to invest in learning at the workplace. How do you get the balance right to make lifelong, life-wide learning a reality for all? How do you figure out the short-term and the long-term trade-offs? Employers are very good to tell you what skills they need today. But what about tomorrow and the day after tomorrow? Who's going to figure out, where do you actually drive competitiveness in the medium and long term? Not so easy to answer. A life cycle perspective, learning over the life cycle. This is the last chart I'm going to show you. It shows you skills on the vertical axis as tested by our PISA for adults and the age of people on the horizontal axis. And you can actually see, this is perhaps the most depressing finding from our survey of adult skills. Why it is depressing, try to figure out where you are on this curve. We are actually doing quite well equipping young people with great skills, but actually as people get older, the skill distribution actually tails downward because we are not investing, we're not continuing to upgrade the skills and the knowledge of people. A whole of government approach, if we are talking about lifelong, life-wide learning, there's a lot of government players that we need to get into the picture. It's not just about ministries of education, not just ministries of employment. Skills are everybody's business. And you can only address those issues when you get the whole of government approach to this. And also, it's about aligning the perspective of different levels of government and multiple stakeholders. I talked about employers. 4 big challenges, but I think they illustrate the scale of the task that is in front of us to make lifelong learning and skills the currency of 21st century economies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas. No small set of considerations there and things for us all to reflect on. That's a brilliant introduction to that part, and I hope we'll be picking up a lot of themes from that as we go through the discussion. Let's turn.
This is Jim in London. I'm just showing off the fact that we can move between Seattle, Paris, and London just by interrupting you there. But the hashtag EFF7 there's actually someone's already tweeted Andreas's presentation, which he has on Prezi. So it's really, if people have seen that, they can pick up the presentation already from Twitter. So it's hashtag EFF7. Sorry, Gavin.
No, thank you for that. An important thing for all those who are listening in and want to take part through posing questions and observations through Twitter. Hashtag EFF7. So let's turn now to Carroll Bellamy. As I've mentioned already, Carroll is the chair of the Global Partnership for Education Board of Directors, and I'm delighted she's now going to join us and give her presentation, which is Access Equals Quality and Quality Equals Access. Carroll.
Thank you very much, Gavin. And thanks to everyone who's pulled this together, and really great thanks to Andreas. I think his comments have really are very applicable in every country and certainly go to the heart of the issue of access to education versus quality of education, although I think it's time for the two of them to come out of their corners and come together. My comments are probably less applicable globally in all countries, but more focused on emerging economies and low-income countries. So I think it's fair to say that over the last 20 years or so, maybe even more than that, the focus in global goals around education have been around access. From Jomtien to the Millennium Declaration and the Millennium Development Goals. Remember, MDG 2, the Millennium Development Goal 2, is about access and completion of primary school. It frankly never mentions quality. And even in Dakar. And so now as we're thinking about post-2015, the discussion comes to quality. It doesn't mean quality hasn't been out there before, but but the focus has been much more in terms of concrete actions around actions, such as reducing school fees, although that's still left uniform fees and books, trying to identify teachers, trying to reduce violence, many of these kinds of activities, but less focus on the issue of quality. Now, that being said, there has been, and Vera reminded us, there has been there's good and bad news, and I'm going to go to my first slide. By the way, I only have two PowerPoint slides, so we can average the number that Andreas had in mind, and then it won't be too bad. So my first slide is what I call my good news, bad news slide. Again, Vera referenced the UNESCO Education for All Global Monitoring Report. And as you can see from this slide, the number of children out of school or enrolled at least in primary school, enrollment might be different than in the classroom, as was pointed out, has declined significantly since 1999. And again, I want to say that perhaps there was real reason for there to be such a complete focus on access. When you had over 100 million children out of school in 1999, you really needed to try and get children into school. So the good news is there's been enormous progress, and you can see this in this chart. And in fact, the latest numbers indicate that there are 57 million children still never enrolled in school, again, as was mentioned before. Now, that doesn't take into account the ones that are dropping out, nor the 250 million children in school who are not getting any kind of education. But the bad news element of this slide is, if you look at the end of it, in every region, with the exception of South and West Asia, it seems that progress is stalling. And in sub-Saharan Africa, the percentage of children out of school actually seems to be rising. So my first point is, frankly, I'm very worried about complacency, and I'm very worried about the fact that we seem to be flatlining. So now let me go to my second PowerPoint. And then, as I said, that'll probably be it for the PowerPoints. And even if you can't make out all the details on this slide, there's a clear contrast between the progress being made in South Asia, which looks on this slide to be kind of a brownish orange, where the number of out-of-school children has fallen by more than 2/3, and the progress in sub-Saharan Africa, shown in blue, where there are still over 30 million children estimated to be out of school. And that's even with population growth. I would maintain that the big challenge now in access is the failure to focus on quality. So that's why I've entitled my presentation, Access Equals Equality and Quality Equals Access, because quality is, in my view, the big part of the problem. I think there's truth to the famous phrase, if you build it, they will come. I mean, we know that there have been much more construction of school buildings and classrooms, but if they come and if they don't get the education they hope for, or some kind of education, and parents know when their children are not getting an education, then they don't stay for very long. So let me go to the second issue. What do we mean by quality? And I think Andreas gave us many insights on what we're talking about in quality, but maybe I'm just going to go to the basics. Quality doesn't mean just enough teachers, although we know we don't have enough teachers, we don't have enough well-trained teachers, and we barely have any teachers for even early secondary. But it means well-trained and properly paid teachers, and they do need to be paid. And ideally, it also means enough female teachers to make girls and boys, frankly, feel at ease at school. Teachers who listen, who encourage debate, teachers who get children to think, to question. It's not good enough just to have enough classrooms. We need classrooms that are safe. Violence is still a very big issue in both quality and access. But we need classrooms that are truly child-friendly. And this doesn't require huge expenditures of resources. Something as simple, and certainly your early grades, of having the chalkboards at the lower half of the classroom might create a more child-friendly environment. And it's not just an education that is involved with rote learning. It's an education that inspires, that actually unleashes the energy of the child to and the potential of the child. So where should we focus? Well, one area that we need to focus are on those who haven't had access. Again, we have to focus on quality, but we've got to. Our challenge is still those 57 million who have no access. In 1999, when we started keeping numbers, the out-of-school children were the most marginalized. They were the poorest. They were the children in rural areas. They were children caught up in conflict countries. And in fact, 20 years later, or 15 to 20 years later, it's still the same group. Almost half, slightly less than half of all the children who've never had an opportunity to go to school are in countries where there is conflict. And yet, again, within global development activities, healthcare, for example, is treated as something that you need to focus on in conflict countries as well as in non-conflict countries. But still to this very day, the least financed, the least supported activity in a conflict-affected country is education. And it's clear we need to have more attention to education in conflict-afflicted countries. Best thing you can do for a child in an abnormal situation is to give or bring back some kind of a normality to them. So again, looking at these different elements, when it comes to poverty, children and adolescents from the poorest households are at least 3 times more likely to be out of school than children from those that are richer or more rich. They don't have to be the richest. And when it comes to gender, the fact is, even though there has been a closing of the gap in terms of primary school, it still hasn't closed entirely. Girls are still more likely to be out of school than boys. And because even when girls are going to school, they still carry many of the chores at home, the fetching of the water, the taking care of the siblings. Girls are less likely to be able to even put in the time at home to do the homework. So the gender dimension is still a very real issue around access. So unless something changes, we are likely to see the same group, the marginalized, disabled, rural, refugees, displaced, the poorest, and girls still the largest group out of school. They're the ones that are not even having an opportunity to be in class. At the same time, or some learning environment. It doesn't all have to be classes. It needs to be a learning environment. At the same time, unless we focus on quality, we risk undermining all of the hard-won gains on access. As it stands today, more than half of all children in school in the poorest countries cannot read anything at all by the end of grade 3. That's why, for example, the Global Partnership, we are now focusing very much on attention to education sector plans that actually build concrete actions in to try and measure literacy and numeracy by grade 3, by the early grades. And in some African countries, children with 5 years of education still have a 40% chance of being illiterate. So again, access and quality have to come together. So how do we change this situation? And then I'm going to conclude. First of all, I think the first step is, and I mentioned complacency in the beginning, the first step is we've got to overcome what I see as real complacency in terms of global activity around education, a perception that because there's been a significant increase in enrollment over the last decade, that the work is largely done in education. But the work is far from done in education. We can celebrate the successes, but it's far from done in education. We need, and I want to echo what Andreas said before, we need a recognition that education is indeed everyone's business. It's not only the business of ministries of education, as important as they are. It requires more engagement by government across the board, ministers of finance, ministers of health, ministers of education. But it also requires partnerships outside of schools, partnerships with education, but broader partnerships with the community, partnerships with businesses, working with employers and business leaders, as well as education specialists. Education is everybody's business. And finally, as I said, my beginning comment, and it'll be my concluding comment, is we have to stop seeing access and quality as conflicting elements. They are both essential if we are going to achieve education for all. I'll stop at this point and be glad to engage in the discussion.
Thank you very much indeed, Carroll. That's a great presentation and framing again of another aspect of the challenges we face. I know there are a number of good things coming through on Twitter. Can I just remind TP centres to make sure their microphones are off when they're not speaking, and also just remind people to make their contributions short and sharp if possible, so that we can get through as many contributions as possible, but also build the discussion. As a first part in the discussion that follows on in response to what both Andreas and Carroll have said, I'd like to go to Haif in the UAE, and I think you had some comments regarding perhaps the more regionalised or more regionalised view of that debate. Haif.
Yes, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Definitely, I agree with all what's being said. I think over the past few years, since the Millennium Development Goals have been set in 2000, there was a lot of focus on access. I think one of the mics is on.
Washington.
The Washington mic.
Washington, we can hear you coming through.
We can hear you chatting, so if you'd like to press your mic and make sure it goes red, that would help. Thank you very much. Thanks, Tom.
For example, in a recent study, not so recent, done by the IFC and the World Bank on the Arab world, the youth unemployment is about 25%, and that's costing the Arab world around 40 to 50 billion US dollars per year. I think this is a huge loss. Although we've done quite a tremendous progress in terms of access. But I have to second what Carroll was saying, that we have a problem right now with quality. And I do not disagree with the starting points, but I think there are some other issues that need to be addressed. One of the key issues, at least in my part of the world, is policy. There's always the debate, there's always an issue around policy, and policymakers really giving education a priority, and really within education prioritizing what is the number one factor that will contribute towards improving education. And from my opinion, it's not the school and it's not the school environment as much as it's having quality teachers. In a recent study that was also done in Jordan, conducted by a consultancy firm called EGRA and EGMA, and they've assessed the literacy skills of students in the early grades, and they correlated that with their performance in mathematics, and they found that there was an immediate correlation, and that there is a problem with literacy at the early grades, and that's leading to poor math skills. And this year we've had a qualitative standpoint looking at Jordan's TIMSS results, and it's not a secret that it has declined over the past few years. And this is a big part of the reason for that is the literacy through it. Now, since I won't talk much more, there is also one last point that I would like to throw for discussion, is that we've seen ICT, or we've seen technology really making great advancement in different sectors, breakthrough advancements. For example, if we take the healthcare, technology has done magnificent results in terms of diagnostics, in terms of treatment, in terms of medication. This technology has not been able to do that yet with education. And I think if we want to address policy issues, if we want to address financial constraints, if we want to address access, technology can play a much greater role at providing access to better quality education around the world. And I think I'll stop here for more access later.
Thank you, Haif. Very helpful in building that. I wonder if we might go to Ramji in Bangalore, and if you had any reflections given the work and the things that you're involved in, Ramji.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gavin. Well, all of what Andreas, Carroll, and the others have been saying resonates very well with the situation in India. It's a huge challenge. We've got a huge population. And to some extent, I think we may be making the mistake of looking for traditional solutions. So from the perspective of our own institution and the approach we've taken, what we've said is, look, learning has to deal with three elements. One is the element, the aha element, and the ha-ha element. And if somehow in the classroom, by training the teacher or the sorts of interventions you have, you can produce these three effects, then, as Carroll was saying, you can bridge the gap between access and quality, which are actually not two different things because they're both related in terms of cause and effect. So we've taken a very experiential approach to learning to try and generate these sorts of effects. And we also believe that one has to look at core skills. Now, for instance, there is this obsession in India with skilling unskilled people or the unskilled graduates, as Andreas was talking about. And a lot of people are finding that even after the skilling, you find you're really not getting your money's worth because core attitudes, positive attitudes towards work, towards learning are missing. So what are these attitudes? And what we've found is you've got to disseminate this or stimulate a spirit of inquiry, curiosity, creativity, and confidence are probably the foundational sort of attitudes that can help you acquire skills as you go through your life. And in terms of access, we found some very low-cost ways of doing it. We use mobile labs and so on. And as the gentleman from the UAE was saying, clearly technology can play a role. We shouldn't overestimate its impact in education at this point in time. We're running something called a blended classroom, an iMobile lab, and the results are quite interesting. So that's pretty much what I have to say, Gavin.
That's excellent, Ramji. Thank you. I think that, there are a number of things coming through on Twitter at the moment, and I wonder if we can go to Tony and just if there's a summary of what's comments and reflections that are coming through from there. Tony.
Yes, a lot of excitement, a lot of interest. Questions starting to come through. I'm not sure whether you want the questions yet or just the fact that people are really enjoying the debate. And by and large, there's a huge amount of agreement. Not too much disagreement at the moment, but some questions coming through. Are you ready for questions or shall we leave for those for a while?
Go to a question or two and see if we can get responses from around the world.
Right. I mean, one of the questions from Tim Unwin, one of our fellows, is surely the real failure has been to pretend to young people that the education they're being given will guarantee them a job. Is this not a real challenge for us?
Tim, I wonder if you want to just give us a little bit more background to that and then put it out more widely.
Yeah, I thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'll be very brief, but I think, for too long we and there are lots of many different we's, academics, teachers, school heads, systems, ministries, have sort of pretended that if you go through this set of qualifications, you will get a job. And I was struck by Haif when he was talking about youth unemployment in where he is. But many countries of Europe have huge youth unemployment. And take Spain, for example. And I think here in the UK, we've pretended to a generation of people, maybe more generations, that actually this qualification will be of some use. And we're not giving them the kinds of skills. And I don't agree that business should lead. I don't agree it's just employment skills. It's all this wider sort of strength of experiences they need to have to actually get jobs and change the system of which they're a part. So, let's stand up, let's take the blame, and let's try and do something about it.
I would strongly agree with Tim that, as you know, I've been an education minister, so some of it's my fault. And I've also been an employment minister trying to pick up the pieces of my mistakes. And certainly...
Wasn't just blaming you.
Thank you, Tim.
She didn't go to health in the end.
And certainly I think it would be a mistake if others around the world followed the Western model, because it's a model that I think certainly fails about a third of children. And we need to look at a pedagogy that fits a post-industrial world, because we're still stuck in the industrial one. And it's one that, in part, also needs to embrace enterprise. Because when I look at the economy, and I don't want to be overly utilitarian about it, but I think Andreas's presentation was very useful in having us also look at the needs of the economy as well as the needs of individuals. That economy obviously is moving away from large mass workplaces. It's moving towards more employment, more growth coming from smaller enterprises. And so we need to inculcate more enterprise within education. Now that involves risk-taking. And risk-taking in education, when we have such high stakes accountability, and when we have the delights of PISA measuring our national systems, when education ministers like me have testing and tables driving everybody to distraction, we have a very risk-averse system. And I think we need to rebalance our education systems so that we can, yes, take advantage of technology, but first and foremost, make room for innovation.
A great message, that, I think, and something I'd certainly absolutely agree with. It just brings me to one of the tweets that's come through, which said that, and thank you for this tweet, which was said that employers are good at saying which skills they require, but who is governing what skills will be required for the future, which I think it sits neatly with some of the comments that have been made there. I wonder if it'd be good to go to Sister Margaret in Hong Kong, but just talking about how that plays out within your world, Sister Margaret.
Thank you. Actually, I think that Hong Kong has been fairly successful in terms of access and quality, because we have been ranking quite high in the PISA. And I feel that what we have been discussing is about better skills, better jobs, and better lives. But I feel more importantly, as one of the members have already mentioned, is really the attitudes. If we got the right attitudes, everything will work out. We will have to work hard and work smart and, and generate the kind of skills, that is required. I think the generic skills are important, to develop in all the students so that they will be able to stand up to all kinds of jobs. Thank you.
I'd like to come in on the back of Sister, because really I'm surprised you used the word values and then you fell back on the word skills. Now, it seems to me that what's lacking in our system is a sufficient emphasis on making sure that our next generation is always committed to working for other people as well as themselves. I'm in a school as a governor where we've just adopted a motto that we're enabling those kids to think for themselves and act for others. That's the first point I wanted to make, and I think that should be something that permeates all school systems, but that raises the other issue, which is our contexts, as has been revealed, are remarkably different. So our ability to learn from each other, notwithstanding what Andreas has said and his organisation has illustrated, is impeded because ministers, not Jim Knight, but ministers have a tendency not to understand the complexity of policy making and moving something from one place to another place. There's a super book out last year by Nancy Cartwright and Jeremy Carter called, I think it's called Education Decision Making, A Practical Guide. It's OUP. Every minister all over the world should read it to understand the complexities and the subtleties of moving things from one domain to another domain.
Tim, I'd like to go back to Sister Margaret and just following up on one to respond to what Tim has said, but also I was interested in what you were saying about attitudes and perhaps to shed a little light on the kinds of things you do to develop the right attitudes or develop good attitudes within your school.
Actually, in our school, for our mission, school mission is to uplift the standards of the students all the time, and we try to develop their confidence, their conscience, confidence, courage, creativity, competence, and commitment. And of course, the first one that we had was charity, which incorporates compassion and benevolence. So we hope that with all these qualities that they have in hand, they will contribute positively to their homes, to their profession, as well as to society.
Thank you, Sister Margaret. I wonder if at that point it'd be good to go back to Andreas and Carroll just to have your responses to that discussion so far.
This is Andreas. I actually must say I very much agree with the idea that we need to think beyond formal education in school. You know, the idea that we grind everybody through the same mill and get the kind of, it's not just about quality, it's about relevance of learning, relevance of education for individuals and for society. I mean, I want to challenge actually, I think it was Hive from Dubai, who basically was saying, look, we're not doing well on reading and math, and that's why we have all of this unemployment. You know, the people who are unemployment in your countries are actually highly qualified. They have gone through lots of years of education, at least a large fraction of them. And I think that's what we need to rethink. How do we create a better match between the kind of skills that drive our societies forward and how we deliver those skills in very basic setting? Education for all doesn't mean to get everybody through the same old model of school, but it means to bring learning to the learner. That's really sort of my main take on that.
And this is Carroll. I guess I would, my comment would be, I agree with much that has been said. Not only employable skills or relevant skills, but also attitudinal skills, inquiry, issues like that. Where I would challenge is, frankly, I think, and I apologize to all of you educators out there or education specialists, I think the professional education field is probably one of the least risk-taking fields ever. And we have got to get education out of the hands of the educrats. I mean, ministries of education need to be involved, and I appreciate we have former ministers of education, but their leadership capacity in terms of something that is less traditional, a broader set of ways of interventions, the leadership isn't there, and we need more diversity. We need a broader community driving education.
Can I just comment on that last point from Carroll, which I very much agree with? I guess my slightly cynical reflection is that the people who comment on education in the media, as well as the people who make the decisions in politics, are people who've done very well out of the current education system. They're not the people who've been failed by it. And that's why I think it's useful to listen more to employers, especially innovating employers, and the people who are starting businesses now, to talk about not only the skills gaps as they perceive them, but the sorts of people that they want to hire, the sorts of education that they think will give people the skills that they want to hire, rather than listening to the usual suspects in our media and in our parliaments.
But you know what, Jim? You have to be a bit careful with that as well, because the usual suspects on the employee front tend to be large corporates who get up and make these statements, whereas what percentage of people are employed by small businesses of 10 people or less? You never hear that voice. So we have to be really careful of thinking the whole world is working from home online. There are plumbers and electricians at the same time.
Sure.
So you have to be careful about listening to the right voice.
Can I come in there?
Gavin, can I make a comment here? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Me or Hive?
Can we do Michelle first and then Hive?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sure.
I'm going to make a comment. I want to pick up on what Jim said about smaller employers. I want to talk a little bit about the new movement in the UK, university technical colleges, which are a partnership between further education, higher education, and industry. And even though big industry are sponsors of these, there are a lot of smaller employers involved in setting projects, taking students on as apprentices, and picking up on what Andreas said about the students who do training and education together. I think it's going to bode very well for this movement. So I think it's an opportunity for big employers and small employers to work together to bring students on in particular areas that we see skills developing and being in need,
And that in the one I'm involved in, it's construction and IT, so very different, though very complementary areas. And I think it addresses the challenge that Andreas has talked about, and it also addresses what you said, Jim, about bringing in the smaller employers. But this is all about, policy allowing that to happen and risk-taking, absolutely. And I think that's what the UTCs have been allowed to do. And I do think that we need to really make education much freer of that bureaucracy so that people can take risks, because teachers are creative and they can be creative. What we need to do is how we make policymakers work with students, work with teachers, and work with industry, as Carroll talked about partnerships, and really look at then how do we scale that? How do we then take that policy, put it into practice and scale it? Because that's the biggest problem we have, is how do we make it scale? And where have we seen, and maybe either Andreas or Carroll can answer that, where have we seen places where the scaling has worked and made an impact? Because you've got a few countries and a few areas in that top right-hand quadrant, Andreas. What have they done? How have they made it work? And is it universal?
Yeah, this is Andreas.
Michelle, just before we go to that, sorry, Andreas, one second. Just a quick reflection on that. Another thing that I think is in there, that what technology can do for us is help us develop networks and communities of practice where networks and communities of practice haven't already existed. And I see a lot of that happening in enterprise, so there's something about the stimulation and support of those. But can we go to Haif and then back to Andreas, please?
I wanted to make myself clear when I said something about quality, because I don't think you can judge education quality by just saying quality of education. I think it has to be more of a matrix. When you talk about quality, it has to be quality of education and its relevance to the marketplace, and looking at it from the economical and national priorities in the country. And I do not see that linkage being done. I do not see all the players, at least in my part of the region, I do not see all the stakeholders sitting together making decisions as to what is next. It cannot be just policymakers. Education is a responsibility for all. It's not only the policymakers. It has to be policymakers. It has to be higher education, vocational. It has to be members of the society. And it has to be the employers and the industry who decide what goes on and what is quality education. I mean, is quality education just being able to read or add and subtract, or is it being able to learn and apply what you learn into your marketplace, into your job, and reflecting it on the economy? So to me, this is quality. It's a matrix that you have to judge quality by.
Hi, Andreas.
Yes, but coming back to the issue on where have we seen systemic solutions to this? Actually, Europe is sort of a great example for this. You can actually almost divide the countries. They have some countries with high youth unemployment, others with low youth unemployment. And when you look at this carefully, you'll actually see that the countries with low levels of youth unemployment tend to be those that where the education system has understood that people learn differently, and they're actually able to embrace that diversity. They usually have combined school and work-based programs as well as academic programs, and the boundary between them is not as sharply divided. It's not that you have to push young people to make choices, either go to university or you go to learning at the workplace. But where sort of learning at the workplace allows people to develop sort of soft skills on modern equipment. It's about creativity, it's about problem solving, working with others. And at the same time, where employers do a lot to actually help people to develop the kind of academic skills. If you look towards specific countries, Switzerland is doing a great job in this. Germany is doing a great job in this. And this is where the solutions are actually systemic, where employers are making not just a contribution in terms of hiring some apprentices, but they're actually making a contribution to the design and the implementation of the education system. And that's really what you need to get right. But there are good examples for this. They exist in Europe. Singapore is a good example that has actually sort of made a switch. In the past, they had basically academic education was revered as the only road to success. If you go to Singapore now, some of the most prestigious colleges are the ones that provide sort of enterprise-based and vocational education. So I think actually there are good systemic solutions.
I think at the same time, we also need not to forget that we want to inspire a next generation of student and youth entrepreneurship. And here in Ontario, the government's just announced a $45 million youth entrepreneurship fund, an innovation fund, to really try to provide support for that. So I think that we also want to cultivate and encourage young people to create these innovations of the future that will be the next Microsofts and Googles. Because if we don't do that, I think we're missing out on a huge opportunity around creativity.
Gavin, can I make a point? This is Ramji.
Ramji, yes, and then just so you know, Michael, I'm going to come back to you because I want to delve into that point about learner voice.
Yeah,
Ramji.
My point is the point about entrepreneurship is excellent, because if you take a country like India, which puts in about 15, 20 million people into the workforce every year, there's no way they can be employed by any industry. There just aren't that many jobs in the organized sector. So the majority of these graduates or the people who come into the workforce are going to have skills that are going to enable them, or have to have skills that are going to enable them to employ themselves or create jobs, not seek jobs. And that's the point I wanted to make. Thank you.
Gavin, this is Carroll. Can I get on your list too?
You're on my list. Oh, actually, maybe if you go first, Carol, and Michael, can I hold you for a second? Carol, you go ahead.
Okay. I don't want to be a downer again, but I think this is a very good discussion, and it applies to so many. But I want to just remind people. I mean, a couple of months ago, I was visiting schools in Mozambique. I visited a primary school, 4,000 students, not a single desk. They were grouped together, sitting on the ground. You could see a number of the so-called classes without teachers. So I think we have to think of this whole spectrum. Clearly, this entrepreneurship, the critical thinking, all of these are very important, and they apply in. There's nothing about being poor that means you can't do critical thinking or do all these other things. But I think that we have to understand that the challenge out there about quality is a very broad challenge.
Absolutely, and it's right not to. I wouldn't ever accuse you of making a downer on that, but keeping our feet on the ground and keeping the broader perspective, I think, is what you do so excellently. So absolutely, and we should be bringing that through in our discussion. But maybe actually there are parts of that Michael can bring out as you reflect on student voice, learner voice, emerging leaders, or however we may wish to frame that.
Thanks, Gavin. Well, obviously, I think we've been really pleased to see the emergence of both learner voice and this discussion around emerging leaders be such a focus in recent debates. And I think with our work at Taking It Global, we've really been working on building out this future-friendly school model that looks at learner voice and student voice as one of the key kind of values that we think that successful education systems will hold in the future. But I guess the question I want to put out there and maybe have a bit more discussion on is when it comes to kind of learner voice and emerging leaders in this discussion around both quality and access, what role do we think that that learner voice and emerging leaders could play, both in terms of developing policy and then in actually helping us implement it as we seek to address both of these issues around the world?
Thank you, Michael. Perhaps we can go to Tom Carroll in Washington. Sorry, Tim, I'll come back to you if I may.
Jim, we did learn where our mute button is, so thank you.
Good technology training, so you get to everywhere.
I just wanted to pick. This is a wonderful conversation. It's really building off of Carol's first comment, which is education is everyone's business. It's really saying kind of what business are we in today, and I think what we need to recognize is that educators and corporate leaders need to understand that they're both in the same business now. We used to do education over here, school was over here, and work was over there. And students were either going to school or they were working, but rarely both, okay? So that in today's world, educators and employers both have a stake in developing global citizens and innovators. And they need to be doing that in tandem, in partnership. It's not enough for today's students to just know more. They need to be able to do more with what they know. And that's why I'm so impressed by Andre's slide about how skill development accelerates when you creatively combine education and work experience. So when we start to think about this notion, wonderful phrase, post-industrial pedagogy, it really is about understanding how to create a simultaneous learning and work environment. Because in today's world, learning is the work. We used to learn to do the work. Now learning is the work. So I think that we're at the nexus, a moment here when we could help employers and educators recognize that they're both in the same business. And if we do that, we could drive forward and accelerate what we're doing.
Thank you.
The list, please.
You can be now. Vera, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I think that when we talk about access and quality being not conflicting goals, as Carroll just said, and for our discussion here, we are coming to a point where actually education has to be thought as in a different framework. It's not only schools and not only one model of schools, and it's not only the Ministry of Education. And so thinking about quality and access not being conflicting is something broader. So new pedagogies is an element very important, but we have to think institutionally and how we can use technology and use the tools that are available in order to make this goal of quality and access getting together something real.
Thank you, Vera. I know Charles Fidel has been hoping to contribute. Charles.
Thank you, Gavin. And yes, I wanted to bring again the issue of relevance on the table, the point about relevance. You realize we have education systems that have been going on inertia. It's not just a question of, let's say, being risk averse. It's also a question of abdicating those decisions to sets of people who, in spite of their best intention, are not equipped to understand what are the requirements of a new century. So even when you look at traditional knowledge, even as you do something as basic as mathematics, you realize that the people that we put in charge of coming up with the recommendations have a very traditional view themselves, because they, in turn, have the confines of their own biases, be they academic environments or what have you, that prevent them from seeing what math could be in the modern world. And for much beyond those who only go to, let's say, 4-year universities. That's just taking an example. You can generalize that to other facets of knowledge that are not addressed, be they robotics or synthetic biology or cinematography or whatever. You can generalize that to other dimensions of an education, as was said here and there before by Carroll and Andreas and so on, and Hong Kong as well, about the need for skills, not just knowledge. That's a second dimension. We're talking about creativity, communication, collaboration, critical thinking, etc. The necessity for character education, which sometimes gets called values, temperament, behaviors, attitudes, and so on. And by character, we mean initiative and persistence and so on. And then, if you think about how do we prepare to remain constantly at the forefront, because no one can see in a crystal ball accurately from the get-go what will be needed in the future, there are shorter-term ways of dealing with this, which Andreas has alluded to, meaning get the employers involved and get the person themselves involved, which is the second way, meaning metacognition, learning how to learn and being in charge of your own learning throughout your life is in itself a trait that needs to be imparted and a dimension that school systems as well as standards need to pay attention to.
Charles, that's excellent. Now, I jump back to Tim Brighouse, who I cut off earlier on, Tim in Bedfont Lakes.
But very quick, because I think it's moved on. I wanted to go back to the contribution about student advocacy, student voice, the involvement of students as leaders, which was a good point, and connect it to Carroll's downer, as she called it, when she reminded us of two very different general contexts of a developed world and a poorer world, which Andreas's presentation also illustrated. I would have thought it might be profitable to discuss discuss systemic ways in which the developed world, through its schooling system and its young people, can contribute to the solution of the 50 million who are out of school in poor countries. They do that, but we haven't had any debate about it.
Okay, would anybody like to pick up on that from Tim, and perhaps Eduardo in Brazil? Would you pick up on that point, please, and make your statement?
Okay, I'm not sure I'm taking up on that point particularly, but I'm a bit concerned with the general tone of the discussion. I come from a time when education was the process by which people were prepared to be persons. Persons who were able to set a goal to themselves and eventually achieve it, and so reach happiness or eudaimonia. Later on, the role of preparing people, the aim of preparing people for being good citizens was added, so we could live together, especially in the liberal democratic society. And now it seems that preparation for work seems to have taken the field, and everything disappears from the scene and becomes education for developing the necessary skills to find employment or becoming an entrepreneur in the digital society. So to some extent, if I can say so, I agree with the claim that education is everybody's business. But I do not think schooling or school education is everybody's business. So despite the talk that we need a new paradigm, we keep talking about school education, educational systems, as if that was set in steel, and that we couldn't have education that was provided, say, in informal circles and families and communities through the internet and other technology, etc. So I don't think we can say so confidently that today learning is the work, or that education and those that provide jobs are basically doing in the same boat in doing a work that is equivalent. I think we still have education as preparing the persons to be autonomous, responsible, competent, to live their lives and achieve happiness or whatever. The role of preparing citizens so that we can live in a peaceful society. And work is something that was added on. We need to work in order to sustain ourselves and those that depend on us. But I don't see that governments, for instance, ought to be supporting skill development that will provide employees for Microsoft and for IBM and Google and Cisco, for that matter. Yeah. So I think we ought to say that we have a responsibility for our own education, for the education of perhaps our family, our communities, but education for taking jobs in the kind of service or industry that we have today is the responsibility of those that need the employees more than of the whole society.
Gavin, I have to comment on that, and I know Adrian, who's sat next to me, also wants to come in. But I think in some ways, there's a happy coincidence because of what is happening in the economy, that if we are educating young people to love learning, then in the end, they will then be educated with the skills that employers need. Because, I can't think of a job for life anymore, except for possibly being a member of the House of Lords in England. And you're going to change career many times during your working life. You're going to have to be agile. You're going to have to develop new skills all of the time and try and buck that graph that Andreas showed us in his presentation. So first and foremost, we've got to educate to have that love for learning and to keep learning throughout your life. And then in turn, in terms of what Michael was talking about in in respect of youth voice and student leaders, I think one of the things that will create that love of learning is trying to design in more peer-to-peer learning, more teaching as facilitating learners teaching each other. And that is something that is coincidentally also reasonably well enabled by some of the good use of technology that we sometimes see if the pedagogy is adapted accordingly. So I think there's an opportunity right now to join all of these dots together, as long as we are willing to think about how we can move teaching practice on a bit.
Yes, can I come in?
Gavin, can I just say, just sat here next to Jim, people probably think I've been doing my emails, but we are gluing in this debate a lot of different bits of technology together, and people are asking to comment, we're looking at tweets. So I was listening, and it's part of the job of running a thing like this. And it's pertinent, because if schools are going to change, we know that children are banned from having mobile phones in class and that sort of thing, but it does change the dynamic. One of the points that people have been making, Gavin, is could our contributors be a little bit more concise moving forward, because there's a long queue of people who want to come in on the debate. So that's why I've just taken a long time to say that.
And Sean here in Central London would like to say something. Please allow
that. Can we go to Adrian first, and then Sean in Central London? So Adrian first, who's been waiting long, but then Sean.
Well, thank you. I've been very reticent to contribute to this because I have nothing. Are you okay?
No.
Sorry.
You are now.
I've been very reticent to contribute to this because I have nothing like the world view of Andreas and Carroll, and nothing like the responsibility for delivering education like an ex-minister and a person who's delivered it in a significant amount of this country on the ground, like Tim. So it's. But one thing I have been able to do over the latter part of my career is be a voyeur, and that's to get out into schools and look at interesting things happen and see where risks are being taken. And that's where I very much am in sympathy with what Michelle was saying about we have, I say we again because I'm sorry, this insularity, but the university technical colleges manages to escape the overprescription of the rest of our domestic education system. It's been kind of allowed to get on with the way it does it. And the one college which Michelle is involved with, I've been involved with, that will be taking students in September, age 14 and 16. And they're going to start not doing their examination courses at 14 for GCSEs, not doing their A-level courses for 16, and doing then some vocational work. They're going to start on cross-curricular and cross-phase projects set up in collaboration with the sponsor companies. So they'll be doing work with Network Rail on organising the concourse of Reading Railway Station, and they'll be working 14-year-olds and 16-year-olds together at doing this. They'll be working in teams. So there's an example of the vision of an institution, that particular college, but working in partnership with the companies, big and small, but using the work experience to drive the skills. I think it was it Tom was talking about matching the kind of skills to the needs, but also it's by the work experience telling you about the skills that you do need. It's the symbiosis between that. We've got Khan Academy. Kids can go and pick up the video that tells them how to solve equations. It's actually knowing that equations need to be solved. So anyway, that's my contribution.
Thank you very much, Adrian. I think there's some really interesting things and some really interesting new models coming through. We might get to those if there's time. But Sean first.
Thanks, Gavin. Earlier on, I tweeted a comment about the top 5 job hire skills being teamworking, problem-solving, communication skills, honesty and integrity, and intergenerational skills. And I asked which of those skills would students routinely see those teachers exemplifying in the classroom. And I want to give an example of why that's relevant. About 3 years ago, I created a robotics laboratory for a school in northeast London. And I was delighted to hear a couple of months ago that they just sent the only all-female team to the Robotics World Championships for VEX Robotics. Out of 700 teams that went to the World Champions, only one team was all female. We haven't heard that word gender mentioned so far today. Where do we make the link between skills and gender and what we're seeing in the classroom?
Interesting points there. Did I see Jim wanted to come in there?
I just wanted to say that Carroll mentioned the gender imbalance in many of developing countries earlier on. I think you just got in late. So.
Oh, sorry, there we are. I think I'd like to come back to Michael at this stage because we've danced around. I think Michael Furdick in Canada, we've danced around a little bit of the stuff regarding the contribution that students might make, be they of whichever gender. But perhaps you could draw out a little bit more of what you think about and what you reflect in your work on the students' contribution to the way education could be. I think there are pieces about thinking about the skills of the present or the skills of the future, where they sit, and a number of other elements of the discussion we've just had. So, Michael.
Yeah, and I think it was definitely a great point about how we could create some kinship and collaboration between students in the developed world and using their voice to support those in the developing world. I think we've seen that in a few different scenarios. A great example is a program called Challenge 2020 that was inspired by Jean-Francois Richard's book, High Noon, that's connecting schools in the developed world with those in the developing world to work together on solving one of his 20 global problems. And we also tried to kind of put this into practice as we looked at developing this kind of the certification or standard for what a future-friendly school looks like. Rather than pretend that we knew everything, we actually crowdsourced the indicators for how you might measure something like that. And we had over 4,000 participants around the world vote on and suggest on new indicators. So as governments, as policymakers look to actually decide on some of these policies, select the programs that they invest in, looking at more innovative approaches to engaging students and all stakeholders in participating. I think often even in the classroom, teachers feel unheard in some of these policy conversations. So how can we leverage these latest technologies to really drive new levels of citizen participation? And I think we've seen several great examples of students in developed world countries working to hold their governments accountable for the pledges they've made to some of the international cooperation and international aid commitments, like the 0.7 pledge here in Canada, that actually would hopefully provide the resources necessary to drive at the access to education conversation. So I think we need to do more to kind of empower and inspire that sense of civic participation and leadership. We've seen lots of it around the world, supported by and inspired by social networking, and I think we'll see more of it as we support this new role of students as leaders in the classroom.
Thanks, Michael. I'd just like to take a moment to mention one project which I think is particularly interesting. The Alternative University of Bucharest, which I've had the good fortune to speak with some people about recently. In that Alternative University, it takes you through four different stages. The four stages are exploring, action, transition, and mastery. So it's not a subject based. The subject can be whatever you like. You will be supported through that process. The exploring is about discovering the area in which you really want to make your mark. Action is about building your initial portfolio. Transition is about beginning to identify the vehicles by which you might achieve what you want to achieve. And mastery is about becoming a effective and professional practitioner in the area that you choose. And the point about going through this project, and the reason I want to mention it, is that in that university, what they are doing is you may choose as your vehicle in that transition stage the building of a social enterprise or the building of a commercial enterprise or acting as a freelance. And I think of those sorts of that model where you are bringing education and the world of work, and the world of work is not predefined as going into a job for a major corporation. It's about, it can be, but that's your choice. It can be about a social enterprise, which has nothing to do with going into a job in a traditional sense, but something completely new. And I think those sorts of models have a lot to teach us. And I would just commend that as an example that people might like to do that. But
Gavin,
having mentioned that, I'd like to go on to Jenny in Australia, or Jim.
No, I was actually going to point you south because I know that as you're on your way down to Sydney, Australia, and Melbourne, see if our colleagues are still awake down there. You might pass Agneta in Joburg, who is in a part of the world where unemployment is a real issue. It's a huge numbers of young people. So I don't know how you want to do the geography, Gavin, but I was just
I'll just, because my geography is bad, I'll do Jenny in Australia, then Agneta, if you could prepare to follow Jenny.
All right. Yeah, I thought I'd bring up a couple of points. tidies up a couple of things. Going back to Hive, he talked about the policy impediments of some governments, and having, like many of you, worked in the Middle East and some of our African and Asian nations, we're still seeing that replication and import of other people's education policies to fix up the nations. And we're continuing to see that learning not for purpose. Where I am seeing learning for purpose, to give a developing country example, so that will marry nicely with South Africa, is in the Philippines. And what I've been fascinated by the Philippines is that they have taken technology for purpose and have done so for many, many years. So the use of mobile phones back when there were those tiny little screen boxes were the things that lecturers have been teaching their courses for bachelor's and master's courses for many, many years. I mean, that was 10 years ago. So you can imagine the teaching that's being done in a mobile world in the Philippines now is quite extraordinary, and the length and breadth of that geography. What we're seeing in learning fit for purpose is some of the examples that have been used tonight in the developed world. So you will see maths and science being taught, but it's the maths and science of the fishing village. And again, although it's the local purpose of the learning, it's still done with quite a sophisticated technology background that we don't see in the developed world sometimes. And whatever is happening there, and I'm not saying that it's perfect and brilliant everywhere, but what is happening there is providing the service industries in Singapore, in the Middle East, working in the Middle East at the moment. Just about every second person that was serving me was a Filipino. They're the health industry of many of the cities of the US. So although we're not talking about building work capacity in their own country, they've taken a different sort of solution, and the learning is successful. They're using the technology to get that learning distributed throughout the country, and the employment for them is therefore happening in other countries.
Thank you, Jenny. And I think, Jim, you're going to interrupt me.
It's the first time I've been asked to interrupt somebody. I think there's a thread coming through from Tony about the bit that Jenny was just talking about there, which is about a two-way process. It isn't just developed on developing. There are lots of things going on, and I think it's a wonderful moment to pop down to Joburg, Gavin, and bring Agneta into the conversation.
Well, let me take you down to Joburg. Agneta.
Yes, thanks very much, and good afternoon to everyone. I would like to ask Andrew about Andreas one question, and this is relating to some of the contributions he made and relating them to Singapore. I'm just wondering, how possible is it to create and manage a database whereby we have the skills base, the required skills in the job market, so that at least the learners can know when they are motivating for their moving into college, which courses to take, and also to help the employers to be able to know these are the skills and these are the schools maybe which we can get these skills from. I'm just wondering how possible is it? And maybe he can shed more light on the Singapore experience, how they are doing it. The other thing I would like to is agree with Carol on her experience with Mozambique. For my case, it was not any different. I come from Kenya, and when we were in primary school, we literally even didn't have desks to read on. And I come from a very, very rural background. And I would really like to agree with her on quality, the importance of quality of education and access at the same time. Because you can access the education, but the quality is impaired by either your low participation levels or the student to teacher relations not being there, or even the study environment not being that good. So I really agree with Carol. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Agneta. And Andreas, perhaps?
Yeah, I think that's actually a very, very pertinent question. How can we tell young people more of the truth of how tomorrow's labor market is going to look like? And there are some countries that are doing quite well on this. New Zealand, the career services system, Australia, Singapore, I mentioned, they actually at least are able to portray what the current skill demand is. It still doesn't answer the question, what is tomorrow, the day after going to look like? We need to sort of also have the longer term perspective, which also highlights the importance for education to play a very proactive role. But there are some countries that are much more transparent, or at least to give young people an indication. Because part of the problem also is that the incentives for institutions are also not right. Often, universities provide the kind of courses that are cheap to provide. It's much easier to educate a lawyer than to educate an engineer. And there are a lot of reasons why sort of the issues are distorted. Young people get misled by what they see in television. Media studies, a very famous subject for young people to go to, not great in terms of getting employment or in social life. So telling young people the truth, where's the future likely to be, very important, very hard to do. You mentioned also getting the employers into the picture. How can employers actually find out, what are the skills, what is the talent available where? Very hard to do. The United States, ONET is an example where at least a good attempt is being made. But in general, we're not very good at that. We can count qualifications, we count certificates, but when it comes to actually what are people actually able to do, it's much harder because, as someone rightly said before, the modern world doesn't reward you for what you know, it rewards you for what you can do with what you know. This is about skills and competences.
But I'd like to raise a point that Sister Margaret made, and she used the word confidence. I think if we instill confidence in children as well, that will come up to them as employees. And I think we need more confidence and a sort of a growth mindset as employees and entrepreneurs and individuals to stand up and say, these are my skills, this is what I want to do. And we need to embed that in our children from a very, very early age. And I don't think we're currently very good at doing that. But
thank you, Helen. Can we go to Carroll just to get feedback from Carroll, as you were mentioned in a couple of the previous conversations?
Well, I'm jumping a little bit, but a couple of things. I was a little concerned. I appreciate that there's good developed country to developing country, but I think that a very rich area now is developing to developing. There are lessons to be learned from different countries. Ethiopia has made major increases in access to education and indeed some quality. There are lessons to be learned there that can be shared with other countries. Indonesia has done a great deal of work with, for example, madrasas, and they provide funding for those where the madrasas adopt the entire core curriculum of the country. The Sahel and Africa can learn from that. So one of the things that the Global Partnership we are trying to do now is to help those who are on the front lines share experiences. I'm jumping a little bit, but I wanted to mention one other thing. Technology, again, even in the poorest countries, everybody has a handheld. So everything from the availability of up-to-date curriculum, which was mentioned in terms of the Philippines, to paying teachers in the rural areas. In the past, if teachers even went to the rural areas, they'd have to leave for a good week, a year, a month to come down to the capital to get paid. Now they can be paid. Things like teacher training. I'd like us to spend a little bit more time on teachers and quality of training and quality of teachers, because it's just crucial. In the poorest countries, you can't just yank a teacher out of a classroom to send them to 2 weeks of training, but doing peer-to-peer, again, using technology. So I think there are new ways of doing things. And to conclude, when I was suggesting education is everyone's business, it's not that business takes over education. It's just that there needs to be ownership by everyone, so that the governments understand they need to put the appropriate financing into education, so that there really is so that the kid that shows up able to go to school but full of worms, that the Minister of Health understands that he or she is contributing to good education as well as education. So it's just has to be seen more broadly. Sorry for jumping for 3 different issues.
Don't worry, Carol. I think we're all doing it. So that's great.
It's Tony McKay. Can I come in?
Okay, you're jumping me here. I was just about to come to you, but can we just do the tweets first, just to bring the tweets, and then you... Then it's both the two of you next, okay? So Tweets and Tony, the other Tony, please.
Hi there, Gavin. In fact, Carroll has just robbed my thunder because she's picked up on one of the main strands that's emerging from the Twitter stream. But the other one that's emerging really is the issue around gender. It keeps coming back, saying that, for example, girls in the UK well outperform the boys, and yet the employers seem to be still leaning towards employing boys. And the question that we've had from someone, well, I'm afraid I've lost track of that one, but was saying, how can we expect education to change and bring about the gender equality when we're so bad at doing it at the home and the workplace? Surely it's not
Tony,
just
that was
education
me.
challenge.
that was me. And it's something that I'm really very passionate about. If we look at the number of CEOs who are women across the globe, we're not getting to the 50%. We've been doing this for generations and generations. What are we failing at? What are we doing in the home? Women still run most of the household tasks. How do we actually get to that? And then how do we do that down at the school level? So we're motivating women to be seen as true equal players across the globe. I do a lot of work in the Middle East as well, and this is a topic of conversation that comes up over and over again. But it's one that's actually harder to have in the UK than it is in some of the developing countries. And it's we're still seen as being pushy or difficult if women stand up for themselves in the workplace. Now, how do we then encourage children to do that in the school where it's openly accepted? So I think this is a debate in itself.
That all-female team that I referred to earlier, they go to other schools and make presentations to try and get other girls, and in fact teachers, to get into robotics. And they're just an outstanding example of that, but they're on their own. What they're now going to do is try and create a robotics GCSE.
Yeah.
I just salute
just, Sean, if I can interrupt, I think you are right. I think there is a whole other debate and perhaps something that we should have. And I think there's also some interesting things which you could bring into that, things like the microfinancing, which is often focused at the women for the kinds of reasons you say. Is that something that acts as a negative because it reinforces existing things, or does it go somewhere else? But I want to jump now to Melbourne. Sorry. Jump now to Melbourne so that Tony and Katrina can make their contributions.
Well, colleagues, I just want to try two things on the nature of the debate that we're having. The first is that many of us are engaged in activity that you would, I think, identify as being committed to system improvement. And there's been a fair bit of discussion about that. But we've also had Ramji and Jim and a whole range of other people talking about the importance of innovation. So I'm assuming that we want to invest in both improvement and innovation. And what I then hear is a series of shifts that I don't think would have been as well articulated a few years ago. I mean, nobody talks now about skills in terms of head-hand dichotomy. So if I think about the way in which Andreas has raised the question about better skills, we've got not a narrow definition of that in the current environment. Second, better jobs. I don't think we are having a conversation now that is narrow about jobs or work. Startup mentality, entrepreneurship, enterprise skills, some of the things that Charles was talking about are clearly the currency of the current debate. And better lives, I'm hearing more and more people talk about value-based and sustainable. And then you get into the territory that Carroll's raising about learning being everybody's business. I mean, I think we're getting more and more examples of corporates, not-for-profits, social entrepreneurs, philanthropists who see the partnership role. It's not just, at times it's actually partnership, sometimes it's supplementing, sometimes it's complementing. And in terms of where learning's taking place, wherever we are across the globe, the nature of formal and informal learning environments is changing dramatically. But I want to just call out 5 things, Gavin, very quickly, where I think we are seeing really big shifts. The first is in the role of government, away from regulator, provider to enabler and broker. The second is in the area of who the new providers are that are coming into the marketplace in very mixed markets now across all of our geographies. The third is on the demand side, and that is, I wouldn't use the word student voice or learner voice, I'd use the word learner agency. It's much more a shift in power, and I know that's different at different age groups. The fourth is technology, which people have talked about, and Carroll, you just brought in the question around an expanded workforce.
I mean, wherever you go now, we're having conversations that have shifted the debate across each of those 5 dimensions, and you hope it's going to serve both the improvement and it will be very much part of innovation. Just to give you one example, the second WISE yearbook, Learning a Living, that of course many of us are aware of because we were at WISE last year when it was released, have a look at the 15 examples, and they are certainly not defined in terms of innovation or improvement to particular geographies. It is not a split between developed and developing. It's across all geographies. We can learn from each other in this debate as we are tonight.
Tony, let me butt in because everybody should know that it's really late at night. And Tony, because you're straddling the screen, if you could move to your left, please, because we're picking up empty chairs. We can hear you talk. That's much better, especially for that time of night.
Because it's after midnight.
Absolutely.
After midnight here too. But Katrina, would you like to make a contribution?
Look,
or is it too late?
I'm doing what I always do in these kind of debates. I'm sort of floating around with a whole bunch of ideas. I just keep coming back to, who's education for? And Tony and I have been chatting in the background about, if it doesn't happen in the classroom, education doesn't change. It's got to be something that the teachers believe in, the students believe in, etc. We're going through massive debates here in Australia at the moment about the fact that our students come out with no resilience. They all believe that they're capable of anything and they have no resilience. And all of a sudden there's sort of a backlash that we have to start building in failure to student experiences so that they can start to learn. And I just think that leads me to say also that there's not just learning for academia. We've got many more students that are completing tertiary courses now than we ever used to, from very, very different backgrounds and very different levels of ability. And education's got to be about life, not just the jobs, and certainly not just about getting through the exams. So when we're talking about all of these better skills, better jobs, better learning outcomes and better classroom environments, just seems to me that, we're trying to narrow down the debate so that we can talk about some of the issues. But every time we do that, we blow out again and we say, well, what's education for? I'm not sure that that's very helpful, but it's sort of explaining the puzzles, the spaghetti that's going around in my head at the moment.
Absolutely.
These are amazing points, Gavin, and I just wondered if...
I'm just going to... Sorry, can I interrupt you just for a change? So if I'd like to bring in Greg here in Seattle to talk about some of the work that Greg's been involved in.
Well, I'd like to pick up a little bit on Katrina's comments because I think there's something that I haven't heard come up a whole lot in this discussion, and that is that, we've been working recently in writing a paper called New Pedagogies for Deep Learning, and one of the things in it that seems critical is, and the discussion has tapped into this, that we need to not just focus on kids doing well in the schooling part, but kids doing well for life. Kids flourishing, I think, is the term that Sir Ken Robinson's used recently. What I would say, and what I'd love to hear more discussion about, is the fact that we seem to be using measures, assessments in education today that have no correlation to what success in life might be. And therefore, if we continue to focus on those measures, I'm sure we're going to get this continual dichotomy between where kids should be and their ability to flourish, and a focus on irrelevancy almost. I mean, yes, we want kids to be able to read and write, but surely in this day and age we can do a job of measuring what it is that they need for success in life. And today, unless we start to address this, I think we're going to be continually going in circles and going back to look at whether they're an A, a B, or a C, or a D, or whatever that means, or whether they're an 87 out of 100.
Now, you stopped more quickly than I thought you were going to do that.
Oh, I stopped very quickly, apparently.
Can
I comment, Gavin?
Yes, please go ahead, Jim.
I would pick up on that. Those of you who are total anoraks might have picked up that here in the UK there was announced today that a proposal that all 11-year-olds will be assessed and then told which which grade they are in terms of, they are at the bottom 10%, the top 10%, or somewhere in between, which I find appalling and astonishing. But it kind of relates to the point that's just been made, and I think assessment has to change. But unfortunately, rightly, schools are being held to be more accountable. But unfortunately, what that then means is that the assessment is the tail wagging the dog, and that's then informing teaching practice, which becomes more low risk because you can't afford to do badly in the assessment. The examination boards are very risk averse because they're so high stakes, these assessments, that you can't afford for there to be a problem with them, so you don't innovate in that area either. And you therefore get sort of trapped in a system that was great maybe, 20 years ago or earlier, but really isn't fit for purpose anymore.
But I think that,
if I could just comment back to that, I think it's, you mentioned accountability, but it's accountability for who? Is it accountability for the students or who? And I think if we don't have accountability for the students, then we're perhaps missing the mark. So my question is, who's going to uncover the emperor's clothes, the emperor's new clothes, and say that this assessment regime isn't working for the primary stakeholders, which are the kids in school?
Andrew, thank you.
I think there's an easy answer to those issues, and that is we need to get our learning metrics right. We need to basically, if it's true that, what we measure is what we value, then we need to get right what we measure. And actually, we can look at the predictive power that different skills as measured have on the life chances of individuals. There's a lot of research on this, and I think actually we more or less know how to do those things. The issue is that we often sacrifice those kinds of validity gains for efficiency gains. But that's a practical choice that's being made. But I don't think that's sort of a principal problem. I think we have to focus more on getting those metrics right by which we evaluate success. And those metrics should not be determined by what people learned in the past, but what is relevant for life and work in the future.
Yes, as ever, the question, Andreas, is
just can we have one at a time?
Right?
Sorry. Otherwise, we'll get confused, or I'll get confused. But Tim Brighouse, you were coming in there. I think we just caught what you said there, Jim. But Tim.
I butted in, and I just wanted to say, but Andreas, could you reflect for all of us on how PISA helps that debate?
Yeah, I think it's a good example, actually. For PISA, we have longitudinal data now that predicts the life chances of people depending on how they scored. And I think one of the things where PISA is very different from traditional tests is that PISA doesn't value the extent to which you can reproduce knowledge, but the extent to which you can extrapolate it. Use your knowledge creatively, and those are skills that are highly predictive for future success. That's not the answer to the question. But it shows the sort of direction of travel. We need to become better at those kinds of metrics because, the answer can't be sort of that we measure less, that we observe less. We can only improve what we can actually see and make visible. And I think PISA is actually a good example for how you can advance in a direction that is actually predictive for the future of people. Isn't perfect, isn't where we need to be, but I think it shows that we can do a lot more than what many school-based assessments do today.
Absolutely. Greg, I know you've got a response on that.
I'd just like to throw in one thing there, and it's not directly at PISA, but maybe it's more on Jim's earlier comments, and that is, the question I'd ask is, in an increasingly diverse world, when we know that people are more diverse and hopefully will have more diverse careers, in other words, there is no such thing as an average student, then why are we so focused on ranking?
Well, I don't think that we are focused on ranking. I think assessments are very good to portray the complexity. They can tell you what your relative strengths and weaknesses are. They can tell you what the distribution of skills is. They can tell you how skills depend on the social context in which students are and from which schools are. That's the question of how we use them. We can always construct a ranking, but I don't think that's the issue of the metrics. That's then how they are getting deployed. But I really believe that if you don't give teachers in the classroom the kind of tools to diagnose where students have their relative strengths and weaknesses, you're going to always have sort of all these kind of problems of diversity that teachers struggle with. So getting sort of assessments into the classroom, getting sort of good diagnostics into the system, it's prerequisite for almost any kind of improvement.
Can I just
that seems to be a huge issue. Actually, we need the data, but it's indeed how the data is deployed, how it is enacted in some way or responded to. But Jim,
and also how it is published. I used to give answers like the one Andreas gave about ranking when I was a minister, saying, "Oh, we don't publish the tables. We just publish the data, and then newspapers publish the tables. What can we do? It's not what we want, but they do it, and it's a bit of a shame." But we could have published the data in a form that made it harder to rank, because we could have published in bandings at least. And then, when the PISA results come out, we're told, here in the UK that we haven't really changed much, but because other countries have improved significantly, we fall down the table, we fall down the ranking. Now, if they were just banded and we were one of those kind of middle countries that are kind of doing okay but are not progressing, that tells us something meaningful. We could probably get the data off OECD if we really wanted, but at least we don't end up with a false debate about the data.
Now, we're hurtling towards the end of our debate. We're not there yet. There's a good bit to go. But I want to make sure that we bring in people who have sat quietly, the way we used to talk about in the innovation, amplifying the quiet voices. I'm not sure they're that quiet. But Pete Chevanini, you've been very quiet. What are you thinking?
It seems to me we're still talking in the paradigm of the traditional education system, and that's what I've been struggling with as we talked about workforce trends and trends toward the need for modern learning. I still, as a traditional educator myself, I still struggle with the fact that we seem to still be within, testing first or testing last, and teachers. And, I wonder if there's somebody who has a comment about places that have broken that mold and are teaching in a very different way, or are looking at this whole education model in a very different way.
That's an interesting reflection. Just so you're ready, the people who are sitting in the background in the city thinking that they're not going to get spoken to. So Neil, perhaps you might like to come forward. But as you're doing that, perhaps we could turn to Fred here in Seattle, just to see if Fred has reflections on the discussion.
Well, hello, everyone. I keep on thinking, I'm a classic teacher, so I keep on thinking about the question of what any of us have learned from each other over the course of the hour that changed us in some way. And part of what I'm thinking of is the kind of models that would challenge the traditional notion of how teachers are educated. I do think that NGOs, in education, international NGOs, should play a role in the ministries of education, should be at schools of education, and that the assessments that are currently underway take into consideration side by side with the PISA and the rankings. I wouldn't bury those. I would keep them side by side so that the debate can flourish. But that when you come from a different perspective, you're an NGO inside of a school of ed, or you're a school of ed, you're an NGO inside of a corporation, that we actually do some blurring of the lines of organizations to allow for people to make these changes that would emerge, so that you can figure out ways to reach the people who reach the people.
Thank you, Fred. I must remember not to switch off the microphone when somebody in the same room as me has spoken. I think if we could go to John and Bedfont Lakes, I think you've a further reflection on this.
So the way it seems to me the debate is split is between those who think that our job is to predict the skills that are needed tomorrow and to provide them within what we teach, and those who see that as an impossible prediction and are promoting the sort of meta skills, the confidence, the ability to learn, the things that won't go out of fashion, that ultimately it means you'll learn what you need to learn when the skill reveals itself to us in 10 or 20 years' time. And it does seem to me that people are very bad at predicting the future. So that does seem to be the more compelling argument. But there are concrete skills that we need, whether it's today's programming computers or robotics that people have brought up. And it seems to me the answer on that is about not being able to predict, because I don't think we can do that. It's about being able to react fast. And that's where a lot of people's suggestions of things like involving industry come in, that these are ways in which the skills that are needed today, that there's a job shortage on today, at least percolate into the school system so that we can pick them up quicker. And it seems to me a rejection of central planning, that governments deciding curricula takes time. And by the time you've decided that robotics is an important skill, created a GCSE, piloted it, rolled it out, robotics probably won't be an important skill anymore. It'll be something else, and it's already too late. Part of this, though, that I think hasn't been touched on enough is perhaps the need to localise. That, to some extent, the people who know what skills they need are going to be the ones developing the skills, and they can see from their local context if industry or social fabric is different in their part of the country or part of the world. It's very hard for big centralised decision-making to decide that for you. And so Andreas's focus on the beginning on equity bothered me slightly there, because there's a risk that if you take equity too far, you end up trying to make everyone have the same skills. And I think the world would be a poorer place if we had lots of people who are average artists and average programmers and average scientists, rather than having some great artists who might not be very good at maths and some great mathematicians who might be very poor at geography and so on. And again, that needs more support for the local choices, for the students to say, I can't make that skill, but I am good at something else.
And I know Andreas would like to just comment there.
I don't think that's the way we define equity, and that's not the way that we should define equity. Equity is not about everybody doing the same in math and science and reading and geography. Equity is about ensuring that success doesn't depend on the socioeconomic context from which students come and in which schools work, and that is a very important objective. You do not want that gender drives the ability of math, or that or that social background drives your success in math. And that's really what we should expect from a good education system. And actually, that's what we see in the best performing education systems in the world. Whether you look to Asia, whether you look to Finland and Europe, they actually do succeed to enable all young people to reach their talent and to reach their potential. They don't end up with the same score in every subject, in every test, but they have the success not depending on the socioeconomic context.
I think I would add to that. I think the discussion around learner voice, or however we frame it, I'm with you, Tony. I don't really like the term learner voice. I think it's an old and a rather tired term. It's something much more organic and something which gives much more power to the learners in the system. So that, I think, is also part of the response there. But I'd like to go to David Martin in Bedfont Lakes, and just to see if you have any reflections, perhaps, on an international context, and then we'll go to Neil McLean in central London.
Gavin.
Oh,
okay.
Yeah. One of the things that struck me very early on in the debate was Carroll's comment that we need a wider engagement with a far greater community of people in the broader community, in industry and so on, involved in education, rather than just the sort of vested interests that we tend to have at the moment. And it's sort of, I think that's the great thing that links together the poorer countries that I have experience of and the more developed economies. I think both of those types of economies need more involvement of different communities in the education system. One of the things, though, that has distressed me about getting back into a closer involvement in education in the last year, after being travelling the world rather a lot with the British Council, has been that I've returned to a debate that we were having 20, 25 years ago when I first knew Adrian, probably more than that, Adrian, because I think we still seem to be talking about the need for a new paradigm for education. We were talking about that 25, 30 years ago, and we don't seem to have moved on. And that I find a little bit depressing. The only good news strand out of that is that perhaps technology has got to a point where it's now more affordable across the world than it was at that time. Those countries that were investing in technology 30 years ago, it was actually very expensive per capita, and what we were doing with it was not very great stuff. Now I think the opportunity, what can be done with it is so much more exciting, but also per capita it's much more affordable. And that, I think, offers opportunities for the developed world that were not there before, and gives opportunities to actually see that quality improvement as well as the access to education that wasn't possible before.
David, and now can we turn to Central London, where we have Neil and Vanessa, I think, who should each make their comments and reflections in the discussion.
Okay, and I'll go first. The bit I'm going to pick up on, because I've been thinking a lot, particularly some of the things that Jim said and it's been said throughout this, is given that we're agreed what the endpoints of this are, because of that kind of broad consensus, perhaps a happy coincidence, as Jim said, about where we'd want young people to be, it seems to me it's all about making things happen. And the particular thing I want to pick up is what the role of governments and policymakers. And I think, just to underline some of the things that have been said, what is definitely a broken model is the idea of a minister on the bridge or up in the crow's nest, scanning the horizon, seeing the future, telling the ship which way it's going to go, sending messages down to the teachers in the engine room who may or may not follow it. That is done, I think, as a model. What's happened in other sectors that have embraced innovation is they talk about things like inverting the pyramid, driving innovation to the front line, that the people who actually feel the bumps in the road should be the people driving the car. So if we sort of agree that, because that seems to be the difference, the potential difference about where we might be now and where we have been for the long amount of time that we're talking about this, I'm sort of trying to have a kind of thought experiment, which is, what would a solution to all this look like that had no role for policymakers? That we didn't start from an assumption. The way we do all of this is change some policy and extrude that out into the system. What would a model that just simply took policymakers out of the system look like? That may not work, in which case we may find an essential role for policy in all this. And it would be the thing that Tony talked about. It would be an enabling policy. It'd be that kind of thing, rather than the idea we don't have enough of X, government must fix it, it must direct schools to do it, which just doesn't seem right to me for all the reasons that have been said before.
Well, thanks for that titanic contribution. Although the car's gone in there somewhere. I think that paints a very, very good picture and makes a very natural segue to Vanessa in a certain sort.
I was just going to ask Gavin before Vanessa comes in, who's the really short guy with a hat on sat next to Neil? It's on your knee, Sean. It's on...
Vanessa.
I think I may well have observations and rather have questions rather than observations, and certainly not answers. I think one thing that's come through for me in terms of the discussion is the need to perhaps get to grips a little bit more with what schools are expected to do, what teachers are expected to do, as opposed to say what government may do or what others should do. I think I know that we can't expect schools to do everything. We can't expect every teacher in every school to understand the world of work and therefore the skills gaps that they may well be educating young people towards. I think that's where partnerships are really important. I'm really pleased that in the UK there's an increasing engagement from employers and industry in plugging information gaps in that way and using technologies and web-based resources to do that. And I think that's very important. So I think partnerships is a theme that's coming out, and how do we get the best partnerships in that respect? I was really grateful for Michelle highlighting UTCs and the role of partnerships there, because there's plugging the information gaps and then there's working together to innovate in terms of curricula to help meet those gaps as well. I think governments have to play a role in the future, looking to the future, but also bringing in experts and looking at data and looking at trends and so forth in that respect. So I think probably two things coming out of that. It's the kind of how do we, what do we expect schools and teachers to do, and then what are the best partnerships in order to get the education system working in the way, I guess, that Neil was saying, which is in a slightly more self-sustaining way.
Thank you, Vanessa. I heard in the background, I don't know, Jenny, did you want to say something, or was I just hearing things?
It wasn't me. I wouldn't mind saying
I was
something.
Who was that? Sorry.
Michelle.
Michelle, okay, fire away.
I want to come back to a couple of things that I think, this business of partnership, I think, is really true. And also back to the comment that Helen was making about women. My daughter worked for a number of months a few years ago in a women's development centre in India. And the students were learning how to sew, to cook, to garden, grow vegetables and things. It was very basic stuff. But what was interesting is when they went back to the villages that they came from, their position and status completely changed. So it wasn't a case of it being women's work or that. It was about raising their status because they'd had an education. And, they weren't raped, they weren't, they were revered, they were asked questions, and they were seen as equals to some of the men in the villages. And I think that's a really important part of educating girls. And I don't think we should forget that, even if they aren't going to go out into employment, that they're going to stay at home and work, we need to raise their status. And we always say an educated woman is an educated family. So I don't think we shouldn't lose sight of that. And then finally, just a quick one on teacher training, I think, and teaching and partnerships. We can get remote trainers who are the very best teachers, teaching teachers remotely over video conferencing, over virtual classroom technology. And we can teach students who don't have teachers that way by using the community to look after the students and to facilitate them. So I think there are ways in which we can do this, and there are answers to some of the questions we posed today.
Michelle, now we've had the Twitter stream going on for all the way through this. So Tony Parkin, would you like to come in with some comments there? Oh, you need to switch on your microphone and then say what you were going to say again.
Right, I will now say. The Twitter stream has been extremely diverse, really hard to sum it up, but I think there were some really useful points coming up. There was a lot of interest in are schools being measured and accounted on the right things? And the challenge is once you start measuring schools, you make them so accountable, you bring about risk aversion, which actually limits their ability to change rather than encouraging it. Was a nice request from someone that perhaps everybody who's taken part in the debate could, as they finish, perhaps put out a tweet to say what they take away from it. So whilst we've all been engaged, it's quite hard. Could everybody reflect and put a tweet out about what they've taken away from it? And the same contributor also said we shouldn't be just talking about one broken paradigm of education. Perhaps the whole point about education, it should be constantly renewing itself. So we shouldn't be talking about moving from one fixed state to another, but to actually realising that this change is going to be constant and carrying on. That's it.
Gavin, I noticed quite a lot of people from Johns Hopkins University have taken part, so I'm just recognising the fact that they've been working here today.
Can I make a contribution?
Agneta, yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to comment on one of the graphs which was showing Africa, that is the sub-Saharan Africa, really. I think the quality of education, or I don't know whether you could take us back to that. What I would like to quickly comment about, thank you very much. What I would really want to comment about the children going into primary school, the ratios just like going to the negative, is recently we've seen so much of challenges coming up from the teaching sector, whereby you find most, and this actually runs in most of the African countries. For example, you find in South Africa, the quality of the educators, that is the teachers, is really low. So if, for example, you get low quality teachers, then of course you would get low quality learners, or you'd have probably parents not wanting to send their kids to the public schools. The other thing is really the effect of the payments. Most of these African countries, you find many teachers strikes, teachers not wanting to go into school, and this can run even up to 2 months. So, and this really affects the quality. You can imagine like a learner, you go into a school and you're in your first term, and 2 weeks down the line, there's no teacher, and maybe you're in a boarding school. You're forced to either just stay there or go home until the teachers resume classes. And I think this has really affected both the morale of the parents to send their kids to school, because it just beats the purpose of taking a kid to school. But you find that it's more risky to take the kid to school than keeping them at home. So you would rather actually keep the child at home. The other contribution I would like to make is there's a lot of competition which is being experienced right now, and it's more on private versus public. And we know most of the learners, like 80% of the learners, would really go to the public schools because of the cost. You would find like 3 times more expensive in the private school compared to the public schools. And you look at the private schools, they take the top cream of teachers and they pay them very well. And you go to the public schools, that's where the amenities are not there, and you find teachers are not motivated. There's that competition between the teachers and the parents and all that conflict. So I'm just wondering if anyone has a contribution to make or any feedback on how do you see as a positive way to address some of these challenges?
Just come in there, Gavin.
Agneta, you've got 30 seconds because we're really coming to the end now. So a very quick contribution, David, if you will.
Okay, well, that is a really good point to make, but I think it's not as simple as saying that private schools do better because they pay their teachers more and they get better teachers. And my experience has been that actually it can actually be the opposite. You look at Punjab is a good example. Has exactly the opposite. The low-cost private schools pay less money to their teachers, and yet they get better results. It is true, people pull their children out of school because they don't see any value in it. And you see that in eastern Nigeria, where actually the children, but the boys get taken out to go and trade in the market with their fathers. The girls go on a complete education and get degrees, so you get illiterate boys marrying graduate girls. Quite the opposite of what you expect most parts of the world.
Thank you, David. And I would like just a very brief final contribution from both Andreas and from Carroll. But if you can be brief, that would be great. Carroll?
Okay, I'll start. I have a lot to say about what was just said before. I do think there are some ways to deal with it, but it does require more investment in education. And again, it requires this broader ownership. I just wanted to challenge. I partly agree that we're still having the same debate we've been having year after year after year, but I do think there are some changes that are taking place. They've already been identified. There is more attention to actually real partnerships, not just made-up partnerships. There is more use of technology. There is more attention to outcomes, not just measuring not useful things. And I think there's better sharing of best practices. To me, these all give some hope.
Excellent, Carroll. Thank you for that. And Andreas, would you like to make a final comment? Well, it looks as though we may have lost Andreas.
I've lost the Paris connection, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I would just like to make some final thoughts. One of the tweets was saying, what were your reflections? Pretty difficult to reflect as you're trying to, or as I'm trying to manage the discussion. But things that really come hitting home to me in all of this, there's something about closing gaps. We talk about the policymakers, the head teachers, the teachers and the students, and all thinking about them all as very separate groups. But how do we close the gaps? And I think that one of the things that we're seeking to do in Education Fast Forward is exactly that. This discussion has included representatives, if you like, from each of these groups. And I hope if we look at the wider participation, we'd certainly see that through. A second one is the focus on collaboration. What we can achieve through collaboration and working together is extraordinarily, I think, much more impactful, much better And that looking for those collaborations, building those collaborations, looking for the ways in which we can work together and developing the skills that enable that as people grow through their working lives or go through their education, I think is critical. And those collaborations, I hope, lead to deep and meaningful partnerships. So partnerships which are not just shallow, but ones where people commit to actually working together through the difficult times and the easy times to actually change systems. So I think that's critical. I'd like to, as I'm doing this, I'm going to hand over to Michelle in just a moment to close finally. But I'd like to give my thanks in having sought to chair. Chairing is rather a loose term for what's gone on. Sought to chair the discussion. Thank you to all the people who contributed. Thank you to all the people who have listened in and posed their tweets. I think that makes for a rich resource, I hope, and a benefit to everybody who's taken part, but also something that we can use to share further after the event. And with that,
Gavin,
you want to
can I
speak,
just say, yeah, there have been a lot of people watching the whole 2 hours of the debate on the live stream, a lot of people tweeting. And at the beginning of this, for those people watching and tweeting, we decided that we wouldn't spend time going all around all the participants and wasting time talking about CVs. But if people do visit the website and the URLs on the screen, prometheanplant.com/EFF, they'll find all the people that's on the call today, and you find people from, like Fred Mesnick and his Teachers Without Borders, all the way through to Future Lab, and there are a lot of people on this call who are points of view about this that we need to follow up from after this debate, because what EFF is all about is about action. We want things to happen. And I've been debating whether to say this or not, just in case we get overrun. But we do have a very small fund, a small fund. And if something has really inspired you today, you think, I need a few $1,000s to try this. I mean a few. That doesn't mean a few in tens. Just you might want to contact me or Gavin or one of the organisers directly, and we'll see what we can do. Now, this doesn't mean we have millions. Please don't overreact and think this is a big thing. But if a few $1,000s might make a difference to something you're trying to achieve that's inspired you from today, then please contact us. So, Gavin, I just want to add that.
Thank you, Jim. And yeah, please respond. It's part of keeping the discussion going and taking action as a result of these things. With that, I'd like to move to Michelle, who I think is going to say some final words.
I am, and most of what I was going to say you've said, because it was adding thanks. But I think it's been a very, very stimulating debate, and I think Andreas and Carroll really sort of helped to fuel that debate. I think it's probably the most heated debate we've had so far on Education Fast Forward, and I think the fact that we actually had to plant for questions was probably a little over the top. It wasn't really needed. I want to thank all the participants in the 18 telepresence rooms around the world, and apologise for the people in London City who are looking a little overcrowded. This has been a truly global conversation, and I do hope that people are going to take away their thoughts and the ideas from today and think about them, go back to the tweets, watch the video again, and think about how it's going to make an impact on what they're going to do next, because that's the idea of these debates. I want to also add my thanks particularly to Jim, Win and Promethean for their really mastering and driving forward this, masterminding and driving forward this debate, particularly Jim Win and Mary Lenehan. And I also want to add my thanks to my colleague Natalie Harris, who has done a lot of work on coaxing people to get out of bed at 3 a.m. or stay out of bed until about 2 a.m, because this is a global debate. And she's managed to get hosts everywhere, and I really appreciate the work that she's put in there. And also to Dominic and Emma in the Cisco TV studio, who have done a great job in streaming this live and making the video available for us. We are going to have EFF8. That will be announced very soon. And we're still debating what it'll be about, but I think listening to this debate and having some early discussions with Jim, I think it's going to be around what new pedagogical models we are going to need to bring about a step change in learning, what these might look like and how they would differ from current practice. And I think we've alluded to some of that today. And I think it would be really nice to actually take that debate forward, to say what needs to change. How do we involve partnerships? How do we involve other people? Should it just be teachers in the classroom? Who else needs to be part of that process? So further ado, I just want to thank everyone once more and wish you all a good day, good night, good morning, good evening. Thank you.
Okay, one thing there, Michelle, and sorry, you nearly got away with the end, but not quite. When is that next debate, approximately?
Mary,
October.
Lennon?
It'll be October, November time.
October, November. Yeah, I thought so. I wasn't going to say, but yeah, October, November. We're just confirming speakers now.
We look forward to hearing from everyone else then, and thanks for those final words, Michelle, and thank you everyone again.
Everyone, and good morning and good night.